A leather trunk hit the dirt with a hard, dead thud. A second one followed, splitting open at the corner. A folded dress tumbled out into the road. A man's boot kicked it back where it landed. A young woman stood by the porch with her hands at her sides. She did not cry. She did not beg. She watched her own life come apart in the middle of her father's front yard. Behind her, the front door swung shut. The lock turned. From the upstairs window, her younger sister pulled the curtain closed without looking down. A wagon waited at the gate. The driver did not meet her eye. Her name was Eliza Hart, and her family had decided she was a thing to be sent away. What happened next on a forgotten cattle road would change every name in that house forever. Stay with me on this one. 3 days before the trunk hit the dirt, Eliza Hart was still inside that house. It had been her home for 20 years. 2 stories. White paint peeling at the bottom. A porch her mother used to sweep before she got sick. Her mother had died upstairs when Eliza was 12, of a fever that came up out of nowhere and took her in 8 days. Eliza was the one who sat by the bed at the end. Her father stood in the doorway. Her father stood in the doorway when they took the body out. And her father, after that, was never quite the same man. Within a year, he remarried. The new wife was a widow named Cora Whitfield. Cora came with 2 daughters of her own. Me, who was 13. Sarah, who was 8. From the moment that woman crossed the threshold, Eliza was in the way. Now here's the thing. Cora was clever. She did not throw fits. She did not slap or scream. She just made it clear, through 1,000 small looks and silences, that this house had a daughter and 2 daughters, and Eliza was not one of them. Eliza got the work. The kitchen. The garden. The laundry. The accounts. By 17, she was running more of that household than Cora ever had. Me and Sarah were taught piano and French. Eliza was taught nothing. She learned by watching, by doing, by mending what nobody else could be bothered to mend. Her father saw it. Believe me, he saw it. And he did nothing. 3 weeks before the trunks came down, a letter arrived. A respectable family in Wyoming Territory, Cora said. The Bellinghams. 4 children, a big spread, a need for a governess. Paid travel. Good wages. Quiet church-going people. The letter was addressed to Cora. Eliza asked plainly if she could read it. Cora smiled the way she always smiled and said the family had asked for discretion. Eliza was being recommended on her stepmother's good word. That should have been the warning. The night before the wagon came, Eliza packed 2 trunks. One held her clothes. The other held her mother's things. A Bible. A silver locket on a faded ribbon. A small folded miniature in oils. A wedding band. The locket had a tiny chip in the silver, right at the hinge. Her mother had worn it every day of her life. She did not sleep. Morning came gray and dry. The wagon pulled up at 6. The driver was a man Eliza had never seen before. He chewed something dark and did not introduce himself. Cora came down the stairs in her good dressing gown. Me and Sarah did not come down at all. Her father stood in the hallway with his hands in his pockets. He said her name once. Eliza waited. He said, "It's a good situation, Eliza. They'll treat you well." Then he turned and walked into his study and shut the door. That was the goodbye. She carried her own trunks down the porch steps. Cora watched from the doorway. The driver did not get down to help. When Eliza reached for the second trunk, Cora bent down, picked it up, and threw it. It hit the dirt. The corner split. A folded dress tumbled out into the road. The driver kicked it back where it landed. That was her send-off. The wagon rolled out at 6:30. By noon they were past the last farms. By dark they were in country. Eliza did not know. The driver did not speak. He stopped once for water and once to relieve himself in the brush. He looked at her sometimes the way men look at livestock they are responsible for delivering. On the second day, she asked him about the Bellinghams. He looked at her like she had spoken a foreign language. He said, "Lady, I don't know anything about any Bellinghams. I was paid to take you to Cottonwood Bend and leave you at the freight office. That's the job." Eliza opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at her hands. The letter, she now understood, was not real. The family was not real. The job was not real. She had been sent away. She arrived in Cottonwood Bend on the fourth day, a little after noon. The wagon stopped in front of a freight office that was closed for lunch. The driver climbed down, untied her trunks, dropped them in the dust beside the boardwalk, and tipped his hat. He said, "Good luck to you." He climbed back up. He drove away. Eliza stood in the street with two trunks, $4 in coin, and no plan. Cottonwood Bend was a frontier town where the wind came down the main street and didn't have to slow down for anything. Wood storefronts, a general store, a livery, two saloons, a small bank, a church at the far end with a bell that was missing its rope. There was no Bellingham family. She walked the main street and asked at the general store and the post and the livery and the two boarding houses, and not one person had ever heard the name. By 4 in the afternoon, she understood she had been thrown away. She walked back to the freight office. It was open now. The agent was a thin man with ink on his fingers. She asked if anyone in town needed a governess, a housekeeper, a kitchen hand, a seamstress, a teacher. The agent looked her up and down and said the schoolhouse already had a teacher and the boarding houses already had girls. He said, not unkindly, "Miss, this isn't a town for ladies looking for work." She thanked him. She walked out into the street. She still had her trunks. She had no room. She had no friend. She did not know a single soul for 2,000 miles in any direction. She sat down on the trunk that had split open and tried to think. She did not cry. She had not cried once since she left her father's house. Crying was a thing she had stopped doing somewhere around the time she was 13, because Cora had once said it was a habit of weak women. Eliza had decided then that she would not be a weak woman. She had kept that promise to herself. A man came out of the saloon across the street. He stood on the boardwalk and watched her. He was big. Not tall. Wide. Heavy through the shoulders. A red beard. He had a tin cup in one hand and a half-finished thought on his face. He crossed the street. He stood over her and said something Eliza is not going to repeat to anyone for the rest of her life. He said it twice. He smiled when he said it. He reached down and put a hand on her arm. She pulled back. He pulled harder. She came up off the trunk and tried to step around him, and he stepped with her, and his hand slid up to her wrist, and his other hand reached for her hair. A boot scraped the boardwalk behind him. A voice, low and even, said, "Take your hand off her." The big man turned. The man behind him was taller, lean through the middle. A long brown coat that had seen a lot of weather. A flat brim hat. A revolver at his hip that he was not touching. He stood with his weight even on both feet and his hands hanging at his sides. He said it again. "Take your hand off her." The big man looked him up and down. Looked at the revolver. Looked at the eyes. The big man dropped Eliza's wrist. He muttered something and walked back toward the saloon. The man in the brown coat watched him go. He waited until the saloon door swung shut. Only then did he look at Eliza. He touched the brim of his hat. He said, "Ma'am." Eliza could not speak yet. He looked at the trunks. He looked at the street. He looked back at her. He said, "You got a place to sleep tonight." She shook her head. He nodded once, like that confirmed something he already suspected. He said, "Pick up the lighter trunk. I'll get the heavy one." She did not move. She said, "I don't know you." He said, "No, ma'am. You don't. My name is Caleb Totham. I run the Totham spread, 8 miles out east. I'm not going to put a hand on you. There's a boarding house 2 doors down run by a woman named Mrs. Pell. I'll pay for a room and a meal. In the morning, if you want work, you can come out to the ranch. I need a hand in the kitchen and the house. If you don't want to come, I'll give you the price of a stage ticket back to wherever you came from. That's the offer." She stared at him. He said, "Or you can sit here. But I don't recommend it." He picked up the heavy trunk like it weighed nothing. She picked up the lighter one. Mrs. Pell's boarding house was clean. Plain. White curtains. A woman who looked Eliza over once and decided, on the strength of Caleb Totham's word, that she was respectable. Caleb laid a silver dollar on the counter. He said, 2 nights and 3 meals. If she stays a third night, I'll come back and pay it. Mrs. Pell pocketed the dollar. Caleb turned to Eliza. He said, "Ranch is east. The road forks at the cottonwood with the broken branch. Take the right fork. 2 hours by wagon, less by horse. Anyone in town can point you. You don't have to come." He touched his hat again. He left. Eliza ate the soup Mrs. Pell put in front of her. She ate slowly. She climbed the stairs to a small clean room with a single bed and a wash basin. She sat on the bed. She looked at her hands. For the first time in 4 days, she let her shoulders come down. She washed her face in the basin. She unpinned her hair. She lay down on top of the quilt without taking off her dress, because she was too tired to do anything else. She closed her eyes. The worst, she thought, is over. She was wrong. But that's a thing she didn't know yet. The hammering started before sunrise. A fist on the boarding house door. 2 doors down from her room. She heard Mrs. Pell come down the stairs. She heard a man's voice. Sharp. Eastern. Not Caleb's. She heard her own name. Eliza Hart. She sat up in the dark. She got off the bed. She crossed to the door. She opened it a crack. A man stood in the front hall in a black suit and a clean derby hat. A travel valise at his feet. Mud on his shoes from the road. He had a folded paper in his hand. He was speaking to Mrs. Pell as if Mrs. Pell were a particularly slow servant. He said, "I have it on excellent authority that a Miss Eliza Hart took rooms in this establishment last night. I will speak with her now." Mrs. Pell crossed her arms. She said, "And who are you?" He said, "Marcus Whitfield, of Whitfield, Pierce and Holloway, St. Louis. I am her family's solicitor." Eliza's hand went cold on the doorframe. Whitfield. Cora's brother. She closed the door before he saw her. She leaned her forehead against the wood. She heard him repeat his demand. She heard Mrs. Pell tell him in a flat voice that she did not wake guests at 5 in the morning for any man living. She heard him say he would wait. Eliza dressed in 3 minutes. She went out the back. There was no horse in town she could afford to rent. She went on foot. The cottonwood with the broken branch was a mile east. The right fork was a wagon track running through low hills. By the time she saw the Totham gate, she had walked 5 miles in shoes that were never made for that country. The Totham spread was not a grand place. It was a working place. A long, low ranch house. A barn. A bunkhouse. 3 horses standing in the morning sun. A windmill turning slow. Caleb was in the corral with a young hand and a gray mare. He saw her at the gate. He set down what he was holding. He walked across the yard to meet her. She said, "There's a man at the boarding house. From St. Louis. He's looking for me." Caleb said, "Come inside." She told him in the kitchen. Over a cup of coffee, her hands were shaking too badly to hold. She told him about her mother, about the inheritance. 800 acres of farmland in Missouri. Her mother had left her, in trust, to come due on her 21st birthday. She was 3 months out from 21. She told him about Cora, about the fake letter, about Whitfield. Caleb listened. When she was done, he said, "How much is it worth?" She said, "I don't know exactly. The land was good. There's money with it. Maybe $4,000. Maybe more." He whistled low. He said, "And if you die before 21? She said, "It goes to my father. My father is married to Cora." He said, "And Whitfield is Cora's brother." She said, "Yes." He set his cup down. He said, "All right." She said, "All right what?" He said, "All right, you stay here. You're hired. You'll keep the house and the kitchen. You'll have the room at the back of the porch. It's got its own door and its own lock. You'll be paid $8 a month and you're bored. You'll stay here until your birthday and after if you like. And when Mr. Whitfield comes up that road, and he will come up that road, I'll be the one who meets him." She stared at him. She said, "You don't know me." He said, "I know enough." She said, "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her hands on the cup. He looked at the bruise on her wrist where the man in the saloon had grabbed her. He looked at the dirt on her hem from the 5 miles of road. He said, "Because somebody should have. A long time ago." Then he stood up and went back outside to the corral, like he had not just said the most important sentence she had heard in 20 years. If you're still with me on this one, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button before we go on. There is a lot more to this story, and I want to make sure you don't miss the rest. The lawyer came up the road at noon. He came in a hired buggy with 2 men on horseback alongside him. The men were not wearing suits. They were wearing range clothes and sidearms, and the kind of faces men wear when they are not being paid by the hour. Caleb met them in the yard with 2 of his hands. Whitfield got down from the buggy. He looked at the ranch and the bunkhouse and Caleb and decided audibly that this was a misunderstanding. He said, "Mr. Totham, I presume. There seems to have been a confusion. The young woman in your house is the ward of my client. I am here to take her home." Caleb said, "She's not a ward. She's 20 years old. And she's an employee on this ranch. She isn't going anywhere." Whitfield smiled. He said, "Mr. Totham, I have a letter from her father." Caleb said, "I don't care what you have." There was a silence. One of the riders moved his hand to the butt of his pistol. Caleb said very quietly, "Son, if you take that gun out, I will kill you in this yard and I will sleep tonight, and Mr. Whitfield's letter will be soaked in your blood by the time I'm done. So think very hard about what you are about to do next." The rider's hand came off the pistol. Caleb said, "You can come back. With papers. Real papers. From a real court. Until then, stay off this land. Drive him out, Tom." Tom, the older hand, lifted a rifle that had been resting against the porch the whole time. Whitfield got back into the buggy. The buggy turned around. Eliza watched it from the kitchen window. Her hands were not shaking anymore. They came back at night. Whitfield was not with them. That was the first thing she noticed when the sound of the horses woke her, around 2 in the morning. Only the horses. 3 of them, not 4. Whitfield had stayed in town. He had paid the men to do the rest. She knew, the way you know in your bones, that this was no longer a legal matter. She got out of the bed in the room at the back of the porch. She did not light the lamp. She put on her dress over her nightgown. She put on her boots. She picked up the silver locket from the dresser and pinned it inside her collar. She went out the porch door. The yard was lit by a quarter moon. She could see Caleb already on the porch of the main house, fully dressed, a rifle across his arm. Tom was at the corner of the bunkhouse with another rifle. 2 more hands she had not yet learned the names of were in the dark somewhere. One near the barn. One near the windmill. They had been waiting. They had known the men would come. Caleb saw her at the corner of the porch. He came over. He spoke low. He said, "Get back inside." She said no. He looked at her. He did not argue. He handed her a small revolver, but first. He said, "2 shots in the chamber. Don't fire it unless somebody's at that door. If somebody's at that door, you fire it twice and you keep firing until I get to you. Understand me?" She said yes. He said, "Stay low." He went back to the porch. The horses came up the lane at a walk. 3 riders. Black against the moon. They stopped 50 yards out. A voice called, "Totem. Send the girl out and we ride." Caleb did not answer. The voice called, "We'll burn the bunkhouse, Totem." Caleb said, "No, you won't." The first shot came from the rider on the right. It hit the porch post 6 inches above Caleb's shoulder. It splintered the wood. What happened next happened very fast. Tom fired from the bunkhouse. The rider on the right came off his horse with a sound Eliza would not forget. The other 2 riders fired into the dark and broke for the lane. Caleb did not fire. He stepped down off the porch and walked into the yard like a man walking to a gate. He raised his rifle. He took the second rider out of the saddle at 30 yards. The third rider made it to the lane. Tom got him before the gate. The whole thing took less than a minute. The yard went quiet. The 2 hands she had not seen came out of the dark with lanterns. One of the riders was dead. The other 2 were wounded. One badly. One not so badly. Caleb checked all 3. He took their weapons. He bound the wounded ones. He came up onto the porch, where she was standing with the small revolver in her hand. The revolver had not been fired. He said, "It's done." She said, "The town." He said, "We'll go in at first light. With the men. With the bodies. We'll have the marshal and the doctor and 3 witnesses before Whitfield finishes his breakfast." She said, "He'll run." Caleb said, "He won't run far." He was right. At first light, Caleb and Tom and one of the hands rode into Cottonwood Bend with the surviving men and the body of the third tied across his own horse. They went straight to the marshal's office. The marshal was a man named Cole Henley, who had known Caleb's father. By 8 in the morning, the marshal had Whitfield in a chair in his own boarding house parlor and was reading him a list of charges that began with conspiracy and ended with attempted murder. Whitfield broke quickly. Eastern men, in Eliza's experience, almost always do. He gave up Cora. He gave up the false letter. He gave up the bank instant. Louis, where Cora had arranged a separate account. He gave up the names of the 2 riders, who turned out to be men Cora's brother had hired in Cheyenne 3 weeks before. The deputy took it all down. By noon, Whitfield was on his way to Cheyenne in irons. By the end of the week, a telegram from Eliza's father in sent. Joseph arrived at the marshal's office. It was a long telegram. It said many things. It used the word misunderstanding 4 times. It asked her to come home. She read it standing in the marshal's office. She folded it once. She handed it back to Cole Henley and said, "There's no answer to send." She walked out into the street. Caleb was waiting by the wagon. She said, "I want to go home." He said, "All right." He helped her up. He climbed up beside her. He clicked at the team, and they started back the 8 miles to the ranch. Halfway there, he said, "There's something I've been meaning to say." She waited. He said, "I'm not a man who talks much." "You've noticed." She said, "I have." He said, "What I have on this ranch is mine. It's not much, but it's mine. The house, the land, the cattle. My grandfather built the first cabin on that ground in 1847, and my father added the house, and I added the second barn last spring. 3 generations of Totems put their hands on that dirt. Do you understand me?" She said, "Yes." He said, "When my wife died 3 years ago, and my little girl with her in the same week, I thought what I had was the end of something. I thought I was the end of the line." He looked at the road ahead. He said, "I was wrong about that." He said, "Eliza, your family threw away something they did not understand. I am not going to make that mistake. Whatever happens with the inheritance, whatever happens with the land in Missouri, that's yours. You decide. But what I have here, and what I am, that's yours too if you want it. You're not a hand I hired. You're not a girl I rescued. You are the most worth-keeping thing that has come up this road in 10 years. He paused. He said, "You're a treasure, Eliza Hart. That's the plainest word I know. I'm a man who knows what he's looking at. And I am not letting go of you." She did not speak. She put her hand on his arm. He covered it with his own. They rode the rest of the way home in silence. 4 months later, the wind off the long pasture came up the way it always did in the late afternoon, and Eliza Totem was on the south fence with a hammer and a coil of wire. She wore a blue dress that had been mended at the elbow. Her hair was tied back. Her sleeves were pushed to her forearms. Her boots had mud on them from the creek crossing. She had a smudge of dust along her jaw she did not know was there. She drove the staple in. She bent the wire. She stepped back. She looked at the line of fence. It was straight. Caleb came up on the buckskin a quarter mile down the line. He rode the way he did everything. Even. Easy. No more motion than the work required. He stopped beside her. He looked at the fence. He looked at her. He said, "That's a good post." She said, "It is." He said, "You got dust on your face." She said, "I know." He smiled. It was a small smile. He had a small smile. They rode back to the house together at a walk. The Missouri inheritance had come due in March, 3 weeks after her 21st birthday. The land was sold on her instructions to a neighbor who had been farming alongside it for 15 years and who paid a fair price. The money, a little over $4,300, went into a bank in Cheyenne in her own name. She used some of it that spring. She bought 20 new head of cattle for the Totem spread. She paid for a roof repair on the bunkhouse. She put a small porch off the kitchen door so she could sit out in the evenings and watch the sun go down over the long pasture. The rest stayed in the bank. She did not need it, but she liked knowing it was hers. Cora had been arrested in St. Joseph in February on the strength of Whitfield's confession. She was in a county jail in Missouri, awaiting trial. Eliza's father had paid for the lawyer. The marriage had not survived the testimony. Me and Sarah were living with their grandmother. Her father was alone in the white-painted house with the peeling foundation. He had written her 3 more times. She had read each letter. She had not answered. In May, she finally did. She wrote a short letter to her younger sister Sarah. The letter said, in plain words, that she did not blame her for any of it. That she remembered Sarah as a child of 8, and a child of 8 is not responsible for a grown woman's decisions. That if Sarah ever needed a place to come, she could come to the totem spread in Cottonwood Bend, and there would be a bed and a meal and no questions. She did not write to her father. She did not write to me. She did not write to Cora at all. She and Caleb were married in April, in the small church at the end of the main street, the one with the bell that was missing its rope. Mrs. Pell stood up with Eliza. Tom stood up with Caleb. The marshal came. 3 of the ranch hands came. There were 11 people in the church and 9 on the porch outside, and the preacher kept it short because the wind was up and the service was simple. Caleb gave her a wedding band that was plain. It was thin. Gold. No stone. He had bought it in Cheyenne the week before. He put it on her finger in the church and he said, "I'll be a good husband to you. I won't always be easy, but I will always be here." That was the whole vow. She wore it on the south fence. She wore it in the kitchen. She wore it at night when she pinned her hair up, and she wore it in the morning when she let it down. Sometimes she caught the light on it when she was working and she stopped, just for a second, and she looked at it. It was the smallest thing she owned. It was the first thing in her life that had been chosen for her, by someone who knew exactly what they were choosing. In the bedroom they shared, the trunk that had hit the dirt outside her father's house, the one with the split corner, sat at the foot of the bed. She had patched the corner herself with a strip of leather and a row of clean stitches. She had laid a wool blanket over the top. They used it as a bench. Caleb sat on it in the mornings to pull on his boots. Sometimes he sat there at night, after he had said his small piece of the day, and he would look at her across the room. He never made a speech. He never wrote her a poem. He never told her, in front of other people, that she was beautiful or precious or rare. That was not his way. What he did was this. He came in from the yard at noon and he set his hat on the peg and he said, "Eliza." He came in at dusk and he washed at the basin and he said, "Eliza." He came in at midnight when one of the cows was calving and he was tired through to the bone and he said her name once, like a man reaching in the dark for a thing he knew would be there, and she would hear it in her sleep and she would say, "Caleb," and he would lie down beside her, and that would be the end of the day. A treasure he had told her once, on a road back from Cottonwood Bend, was the plainest word he knew. He had been right about that. A trunk had hit the dirt outside her father's house on a morning in late October, and a folded dress had tumbled into the road, and a man's boot had kicked it back where it landed. A family had decided she was a thing to be sent away. A cowboy had decided she was a thing to be kept. And on a fence line, on a bright afternoon in a country she had not chosen but had come, somehow, to love, Eliza Totham drove a staple into a post and bent the wire and stepped back, and the line was straight, and the wind came down the long pasture the way it always did, and the man she had married stopped his horse beside her and said her name. She turned her face up to him. She smiled. That was the whole story.